Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and today is a Patreon request from the artist. I'm going to be reviewing the debut album by Ethereal Bonds, Undone. Ethereal Bonds is an experimental electronic artist from Plauen in Germany who is making his first release of any kind with this album. All the music I'm going to be talking about today is essentially his first statement as an artist, and as you'd expect, he's still working toward having a substantial following. Now, normally I wouldn't create a video on an album by the person who sent in the request, so please don't take this as me changing my rules. But I did create that Patreon tier with, really small independent artists in mind. When I heard that Ethereal Bonds was an actual signed artist and Undone was enticingly described as an experimental concept album 3 years in the making, I could not pass on this offer, and boy am I glad I didn't. In fact, in a couple of years' time, I highly doubt Ethereal Bonds will even remotely fit into this category of small artists. When I started this channel, never did I suspect that I'd be contacted by an artist of this caliber, with music so emotionally rich and utterly professional. Having had the privilege of sitting with this album for a few months before its official release, it's unquestionably a highlight of the year in my eyes, and I feel incredibly lucky to have been around at the start of what I think could be something great. The artist also generously provided me with a wealth of background information on his story and that of each track on the album, enabling me to cut a lot deeper into the album and its conception than I usually do. So I really hope I can return the favour with this video. Undone is essentially an album about the transience of human life, as evidenced in titles like Time Pervades Us All and A Fading Memory, as well as sonic motifs such as a ticking clock and the sound of church bells. It's dense and often forceful, but diligently produced throughout its lengthy runtime, branching off the principles of glitch house into wide-ranging sonic terrain. Artists like Max Cooper and John Hopkins come to mind, but Ethereal Bonds has far too much of his own darkly cinematic flair for the album to feel like any kind of imitation. Plus, don't take it lightly when I say that his production chops are almost indistinguishable from artists of that caliber. You could have told me that this was a big new producer with hundreds of thousands of monthly listeners, and I'd easily believe it. All the while, there's a dichotomy between this intense sound design and what's almost like chamber instrumentation, providing much of the album's emotional core. It took me until my first front to back listen of this album to start to feel just how sad it is. There's glimmers of hope and moments of peace across its runtime, but there's a lot of hurt at the heart of the album. Undone is clearly a very sincere emotional expression that was incredibly meaningful for the artist, and its long production process has paid off beautifully. This is one of the most affecting new albums I've heard in 2023, and I think Ethereal Bonds has achieved exactly what he set out to. The album opens on a foreboding widescreen image, where languid drones give way to filmic strings and powerfully kinetic drum patterns. There's a section where the ticking of a clock weaves itself into an incredibly satisfying and complex rhythmic interplay. The artist just fully flexing his production skills right out of the gate. Then everything slowly snowballs into a gnarly beast of sound, set to a distorted kick drum slicing unrelentingly through the mix, before the track finally winds down into pensive stillness, cutting down the mix to just piano and flute. It's a pretty bold and impressive mission statement for the album, one that only becomes more interesting with the knowledge that the sections of the track are meant to represent the progression of a human life, beginning with a powerful genesis which leads into a burst of free-flowing exploration, before you start to be boxed into a brutal regular rhythm, and finally are left with a quiet melancholy in the wake of it all. Not a view of the world I want to subscribe to, but with the way the themes are integrated into the music, the track manages to be both coherent in its storytelling and highly enjoyable on a pure compositional level. A very strong start. Going into this second track, initially the staccato sound of what's almost like a flamenco guitar makes for quite a startling transition. It's a striking element to bring into the established sonic environment of the album, and when I heard a full-on four-to-the-floor kick drum come in on first listen, I wasn't sure that this felt like much of a natural continuation of what the first track set up. But over time it builds up into something much more weighty and complex. The tango style provides almost a rare moment of levity in this deeply melancholic album. The artist described the track as fundamentally optimistic, which I definitely agree with. But when you bring erratic industrial sound design into the mix, you do get a sense of the darkness surrounding the titular dancers, creating a sort of dance macabre tone that fits into the greater context of the album. There's this one mechanical sound I particularly like that seems to get stuck in a loop as the track builds into a hypnotic cycle, complete with subtle textures glitching all over the place as per usual. And once again, this all finally gives way to a bleak but rather beautiful piano passage. Which flows right into the opening of A Fading Memory with one of the most memorable and emotionally affecting melodies on the album. The track isn't as dense or overwhelming as the two that preceded it, allowing itself to ebb and flow and build a powerful atmosphere. Thus you get even more of a tangible sense of longing. The theme of the track is nostalgia and yearning for the past, made clear through the atmospheric use of a field recording. And the eventual sweeping climax is one of the most string-led moments on the LP, and also easily one of the most touching. Speaking of which, few of these tracks hit me in the gut like this one. It's acoustic guitar driven, and despite the usual intensity of the production, has a tender emotional core throughout. The section where the percussion drops out to let the cello just soar is damn near heartbreaking. Everything rises to incredible heights, propelled by warped driving bass, before dissolving into plaintive piano and disintegrating glitch effects. The theme of an unfulfilled longing for love and connection is not only poignant, it's something you can just feel without even reading the title. The artist layered a field recording of the sorrowful sounds of cattle into the track, and more significantly, the way it's structured feels decidedly unresolved, like the music is reaching towards something that's ultimately never found. It's definitely a personal highlight, and I'm absolutely thrilled to hopefully be remixing this track in the near future. I'll try my hardest to put in the level of care and emotion that Ethereal Bonds so clearly put into the original. And here we get basically the clear centerpiece of the album. It's the title track, it's the longest at just over 11 minutes, it's bang in the middle of the track listing, and it's also incredible. The dark ambient soundscape that opens the track is a welcome pause in the album experience, giving the sound design and the listener room to breathe, which is especially needed since we're about to launch into the densest, most complex passage of music on the entire album. Ethereal Bonds absolutely produced his socks off here, and at any given moment so many sounds are flying past your head that you'd think there'd be too many ingredients for cohesion and clarity, but I cannot stress enough how fantastic this track sounds. The fact that he's just burst onto the scene producing music of this caliber is pretty mind-blowing to me. At the midpoint, everything drops down to just piano, subtle ambience, and the sound of a baby chattering. The way this bit of the track makes me feel is quite difficult to describe. Eerie doesn't quite cut it, but this is undoubtedly one of the moments on the album with the most powerful effects on me. Then in the final third, everything gradually builds and accumulates more and more layers over time into a storm of sound that finally caves in on itself and comes fully Undone. This is another conceptual piece and clearly a sonic exploration of turbulent emotions and the different forms that inner darkness can take on. The personal meaning of the track which the artist shared with me does run so deep that I can't disclose everything in this video, but Undone really does feel like a complete artistic expression straight from the heart. If I'm really nitpicking, Leaving My Shadow Behind is a bit of a similar case to Soul's Tango and Dead Cities, where it's a little undersold by its intro. I'm not huge on the sounds of the pad and sampled drums used at the beginning, considering the album's incredibly high standards of production, but then everything swerves into a new direction with a filthy bass line and some of the most propulsive drums on the whole LP, gathering more and more momentum over time until, for all its dark atmospherics, the track feels uniquely danceable. At face value, I almost want to call it triumphant, starting from an ominous soundscape, then finding transcendence through relentless motion. But there's kind of a strong double meaning here, especially in the deliberately ambiguous title. Out of the chaos and disorder, the track represents a moment of strength and clarity in the album. But then, are you moving out of the shadows and finding a way to carry on with hope, or doing the complete opposite? The tone and message of the track is definitely up to subjective interpretation, so it overall definitely does stand out as a strong and unique moment. This album has been very consistently strong up to this point, but with such a long experience, the one thing that I did feel I needed at this point was a proper pause and some respite. And that's exactly what this track delivers, right at the point where it's most effective. The first 6 tracks deliver an emotionally and sonically intense 45 minutes of music, whose momentum and potency could be a little diluted if a piece like Tranquility were placed in the middle of them. Instead, it arrives where a prolonged moment of stillness is most striking and welcome, just before you would have run the risk of listener fatigue. Ethereal Bonds quite literally put his heart and soul into this track. A recording of his own heartbeat forms the soft and steady pulse over which strings, expansive drones, and a whole host of deftly warped and manipulated acoustic instruments rise like a spring tide or a winter sun. It's bleakly beautiful and, once again, very emotionally resonant for me, on top of being a crucial piece of the overall experience. And here we have the penultimate track on the album, which was also the first one recorded, and you could probably tell based on its more simplistic arrangements. If you really wanted to point your finger at a track that's not strictly exploring new sonic terrain, you could argue that all the stops have already been pulled out in pieces with a more elaborate take on this style. But I think that the calmness and clarity of this track smoothly continues a sort of arc out of the chaos of the album's first half. Plus, it's clearly meant to go as a pair with Tranquility. Both have music videos forming a single narrative, where a character rises out of some sort of depressive state to become the central ghost figure, who then journeys out through suburbia and nature and finally disappears into a lake. It's some impressive work that definitely deserves more attention. As for the music itself, the track begins in rather hypnotic minimal house territory, with a uniquely strong focus on melody and some lovely piano playing. It shows some pretty strong John Hopkins influence in its chord progression, but since it's still nowhere near imitation, that's a positive for me. Around the 6-minute mark, the groove reaches its apex with some incredibly strong and satisfying swells of bass, really sounding like they could just reach out and swallow you up. Finally, there's a long beatless outro where, as everything drops down to solitary piano, you get perhaps the strongest sense of resolution and peace on the entire record. The decision to end the track with a pure major chord was unexpected and quite poignant. It would have been a beautiful place to end the whole experience, but there's just one more piece left to round it all off. The conceptual nature of the album is mostly relegated to self-contained ideas within individual tracks, but the way it's bookended is a key part of the overall experience and narrative. Track 1 represents the inexorable passage of time and how your perception of it shifts as you grow older, and then this is like its part 2, where all of that gradually slips away into darkness. The sound of the album is significantly stripped down to make the piano the focal point, playing a soft, elegiac tune that gradually floats upwards as bleak ambience rises into something cold, expansive, and painfully beautiful. Funeral knells echo in the distance as everything glitches and disintegrates, and once again all you're left with is a faint, solitary glimmer of piano, slowing and fading very gradually into nothingness like the last glimpse of a setting sun. At the end of the whole experience, these final few minutes of the album are damn near heartbreaking and sometimes a little tear-jerking. I couldn't think of a more resonant and fitting conclusion. Honestly, I'm kind of at a loss for words for how grandiose and complete this album is as a debut. I haven't really mentioned the fact that every track runs between 6 and 12 minutes, adding up to a pretty sprawling hour and 15 total, but the artist does a wonderful job at harnessing the space the album occupies, filling out the music with detail, but still knowing when to hold back and allow the tracks room to breathe as you sink deeper into their melancholy atmosphere. The record apparently took 3 years to put together, and it really pays off. Clearly the utmost care went into fully realising the artist's vision. If there's anything that ever stops me from wanting to come back to the album, it's the emotional intensity of the whole experience. Tracks 1 to 6 can honestly leave me pretty exhausted and relieved to hear the first beatless piece on the album, but would I want them cut down? No, music isn't always meant to be comfortable, and I think Ethereal Bonds achieved exactly the emotional effect he intended. I've actively tried to offer something in the way of constructive criticism in this review, and basically failed apart from inconsequential nitpicks. I have to reiterate what an honour it is to have had this sent in to me. I already feel that Ethereal Bonds is developing into quite a special artist, and getting to experience the birth of some exciting music up close makes me so glad I started this channel. But even if I put that perspective aside, Undone is just one of the finest, most impressive new albums I've heard this year. This review has definitely run on longer than I expected, but to cap it off, I give this album my full recommendation and an 8.5 out of 10. Please do check out the album on streaming, linked down below, or be amazing and buy it on Bandcamp. It's getting harder and harder for talented new artists to get the support they deserve, and if I can direct people towards such artists, then that's basically the ultimate goal as a reviewer. But for now, thank you for watching, see you next time.